So on page 2 of the preface, he makes this observation. He is looking for metaphysics of morals, whether there could be any kind of a priori, prior to experience principles that we can have some principles of moral reasoning that is independent of all experience. Sometimes we have this thought that you need to do something regardless of the circumstances. That is the beginning of the idea of duty. And there he looks for the origin of moral metaphysics. And that will be the idea of duty. Some of you asked that. What is duty? Is something I need to do, something I must do. Now, this might be with respect to what is specific. You must do this, you must do that. It might change according to circumstances. But similar to a distinction that Descartes made, namely that you have to do that you have an obligation, is the result of moral reasoning. That idea that it is compelling. So he says, since this is on page 2, the last paragraph, since I'm here primarily concerned with moral philosophy, the foregoing question will be limited to a consideration of whether or not there is the utmost necessity for working out for once a pure moral philosophy that is wholly cleared of everything which can only be empirical and can only belong to anthropology. So what he is looking for is something not empirical, not something that changes according to perception, according to circumstances, according to historical context. Something, he says, there must be such a philosophy is evident from the common idea of duty and moral laws. Everyone must admit, and when Kant says every time one admit, we should concentrate on that if a law is to be morally valid, is to be valid as a ground of obligation, then it must carry with it absolute necessity. This is very crucial to understand because this is his understanding of what morality should be based on. Now, the insight here is, if somebody says, you should do it, but I'm not going to do it. Some people should do this, but I'm not going to do it, or the others don't need to do it. This kind of reasoning, Kant believes, actually is against our own moral reasoning, in which we somehow think, and you should think whether you really think that if it is moral, it should be valid for everybody. That is the rational principle behind it. Now, once we grasp that, why that is the case, that morality cannot be, should not be relative to certain people, certain times, etc., but it must be absolutely necessary. Now, we might not believe that it is possible. We might not believe that we can find a principle like that. And we all are in the 21st century much more relativistic, much more sensitive to the historical context. We tend to think oh, what counts as morality in one culture doesn't count in another culture. Everybody has different moral standards, etc. And his response to that, yes, that is good, as some of you asked, in a specific sense. It is good for this culture in this historical context with respect to this behavior, etc. The question that he is asking, can there be something that is good in itself? Absolutely good. In itself, in the sense that it doesn't serve any other purpose. It's just good for the sake of itself. That is the question. Now, if we can find this, that what he is looking for, this is a universal reasoning that is valid for all human beings across history, across geography, across the world, etc. But the fundamental question here is, yes, specific empirical moral laws can change from one culture to another. Namely, you might do certain things in one culture, you might not do in another, you might do certain things in certain times of history, and you might not. But is there a principle at all that is and can be good in and of itself, hence therefore valid for everybody? Absolutely good in itself. Now, suspecting maybe I'm wrong, you being the children of 21st century or late 20th century, you don't believe that. You think that, oh, that's just universal, and we go to sensitive schools in which they teach us cultural differences. Therefore, I should not believe in something universal that is valid for all human beings. Am I right or am I wrong? What do you think?
I think that because he talks about how like the thing that he's searching for is like free of circumstance, it seems like it's something that could apply to a lot of different people in a lot of different settings.
But you say a lot, you don't say all.
Right.
You
I
still
think,
want to resist that. You still want to say a lot of people, but not all people at all times.
yeah.
Okay.
I do think that like the broadness of what he's looking for makes it something that seems like it could apply to more than just like one culture or something.
Okay. Um, okay, I'm going to stop here. Are actually not the supreme principle of morality. Because the supreme principle of morality is going to be formal. In order to be able to be independent of all empirical circumstances and to be universally valid, it is going to be something purely formal that determines your will. Therefore, he starts out the discussion with what can be unconditionally good. Only why you are doing, and that's why it's the formal principle, why you are doing what you are doing. What is the principle according to which you are engaged in your action? The consequences of your action, the context of your action, the circumstances of your action cannot be universal because they're always empirical, they're always in a spatio-temporally specific context. I cannot, for example, name any action moral without knowing why that action is done. I cannot look at empirically certain actions and judge them moral because I don't know what they are, why they are done. I only know why I do my action. And it is true, yes, you cannot judge any action of another person. But he gives examples. He gives examples in this context, like in everyday language, we use the term duty, like something that you must do. If you act in accordance with your duty, that doesn't mean that you are moral. So all the actions, somebody asked this, all the actions that are against your duty cannot be considered to be moral. Like you lie, you cheat, etc. We don't even consider those as moral actions. But just because you seem to be acting according to a law, according to morality, according to moral law, according to your duty, that doesn't mean you are moral. So he gives 4 examples. I go over them a little bit. The first one being the actions that are contrary to morality, those contrary to duty, and they are not moral. Now, there are also actions that in accordance with duty, but there is an indirect inclination to do it. That is the example of the shopkeeper who is charging the same price to everybody. It is in accordance with duty. This is most of our sort of understanding of people like, not people, well, people, but institutions like Amazon and all the shops and businesses, etc. They are business ethically moral, like they have business practices, but they know that you know they are doing it for to keep the business going. They are acting according to duty because they have an indirect inclination. Yes, I would like to charge you $100 rather than 50. That's my direct inclination, to get as much money from you as possible. But if I do, then I might lose customers. Then I might lose my reputation. Then people might not continue to shop with me. So I have an indirect, long-term inclination to keep growing, to keep being profitable, etc. Therefore, I don't do certain things. And that is the entire notion of morality we seem to have nowadays. You need to suffer. If you need to suffer, you are going to act morally. So somebody comes and, I apologize for all the cause that all the sort of pain I caused, etc. You are just doing this in order to be relevant, to keep selling your product, to keep your reputation. This is not a moral act, right? So we cannot really base morality on the basis of motivations that we know to be ultimately selfish. This was the example of Bill Gates giving $1 million donation. That doesn't impress me. I mean, it's a good financial act, so different senses of the good. So good only for something else. And as long as it is good for something else, Kant believes it's not morally good. Now, the actions that he gives are actually sort of counterintuitive and problematic. So he says, well, there is a duty not to kill yourself, and there is also an immediate inclination, therefore, because you don't want to die. That's an immediate inclination. So you can't go around and say, hey, I didn't commit suicide today, I'm so moral, because you have an immediate inclination to live. But the example that he gives is sort of like hyperbolic. Like he says, if your life sucks, if everything is terrible, if you much rather die, so you have no inclination, no desire, no will, no sort of desire to live, but you still don't kill yourself. That for the first time, I can tell maybe you are doing this out of duty, because of duty, not just in line with duty, but just for the sake of duty. So, and then you think, wow, that's a pretty high standard for the morality of an action. And it is true. He says, yes, it is an incredibly rare, incredibly valuable, and therefore rare occurrence. We toss around the word morality constantly in order to refer certain advantages and disadvantages behavior. We are actually undermining the value of morality. We are cheapening it. It is a very rare commodity, or a very rare occurrence. It's possible that no one might not have ever acted morally in the entire history of the humankind. They might have always acted out of a self-interest. But for Kant, that makes it all the more rationally important, because just because it is rare doesn't mean that it's useless. In fact, quite the opposite, it is the most valuable. So if you are looking under morality, a code of conduct, Kant is not going to give that to you. He's not going to tell you, do this, do that, because that's laziness. That's in order to find a way in life, a kind of path in life, and this is how you should act. Somebody else is telling you, in fact, that's not even freedom, but he is giving you what morality is, and the only person who can tell the morality of an action is the rational being who is behind the action. So in a sense, he doesn't have this kind of universalistic, imperialistic tendencies necessarily, because he doesn't really tell you you should do this or not do that. And People might question whether all human beings are rational, whether that's a good thing, etc. And we might, but for Kant, the dignity of each and every human being is based on the fact that they are capable of rational thinking. Therefore, that should be the basis of morality, nothing else. Religion cannot, custom cannot, uh, uh, culture cannot. These are all specific, changing, different uh, sources. They can never be the cause of morality. They can be the cause of what he calls practical anthropology, how people act, how people do not act, etc. But that those by definition cannot be universal. And in fact, he says that you should never try to universalize what is not universal. That would be the definition of colonialism and imperialism. So, do I believe that? I don't know. I really don't. But this is what Kant thinks in terms of the possibility of universal principle. Is that clear? So now he moves from the duty, the everyday understanding of duty, to something that is what he calls more metaphysical. Some of you asked about the movement of the text. And yes, he moves to sort of acting in accordance with the law. Now here, the moral law is very tricky because the issue here, he doesn't give you a law. He doesn't say, thou shalt not kill, or 10 of them, thou shalt not commit blah, blah, adultery. He doesn't give you any content because every content is empirical and depends on the circumstance. All he gives you is this notion of human beings' capacity to act according to laws. Each human being has the capacity to act according to laws. That's what it means to be rational. Now, what that law is, he doesn't know, he doesn't say. So he doesn't give you like, this is the moral law, do this and you are always going to be moral. No, because you might do the very same action for completely different reasons, and one would be moral, one wouldn't. That's our insight, that's the reasoning. And he thinks when he says that, everybody is going to understand it because everybody has reason and knows how to think about morality. I mean, to the extent that they are capable, of course, but every human being is potentially a rational being. You cannot exclude anybody from this. You cannot say these people are capable, these people are not. Because when you say, my morality comes, for example, if I say, my morality comes from Islam, and if I'm proud of that, what I'm implicitly saying is, since you are not Muslim, you don't have morality in the way that I do. And I, by definition, think that since I'm moral, I think I'm superior to you because you lack what I am so proud to have. So you can't be moral. That to me is what is wrong with basing universal morality on the basis of specific religions. So one of the criticism of imperialism is mostly it's a Christian phenomenon, historically speaking. Why? Because people believed that Christianity was absolutely the universal truth and path to morality. And they brought that to Africa, to Asia, to other places in the world. And that was sort of the cause of this whole imperialist framework. Now, since you're moral, I mean, since you believe you are moral, since you are like God chosen people, etc. I mean, that's not Christian, but whatever. So then you are going to impose that upon other people, whether you want it or not, whether you intend it or not, because you have the presumption that you know the universal truth, morality. Now, for Kant, it is not Christianity, it is not any religion, nothing specific, nothing historical, nothing cultural. It is rational. It is valid for all human beings. All human beings' ability to give a law unto it themselves and follow those laws. And the law is actually very empty, almost circular, almost too simple, deceptively simple, that you sort of say, oh, is that it? After all this kind of boo-ha-ha, this is what you can come up with. But for Kant, that's really the only criterion of universality. And then we come to that after a break because unusual amount of people are yawning today. So, okay, so I want to jump to page 13 and start the discussion from there. So on page 13, moral worth, he says at the very top, depends, therefore, not on the realization of the object of action, but merely on the principle of volition, according to which, without regard to any objects of the faculty of desire, the action has been done. So, in principle, as a rational principle, he thinks we know that if somebody commits an act in order to fulfill a personal desire, personal interest, or achieve an end, or produce some circumstances, we know that that is not a moral act. We can designate that act useful, advantageous, even good from a cultural perspective, even maybe economically a good decision, etc., but we wouldn't consider it moral. So I go back to the example of Bill Gates donating $1 million, or anybody for that matter donating $1 million. That might be good for those who are donated to. It might be good for a public relations perspective. It might even be good economically for the well-being of that town or place that he or she donated that money. But the issue here is that we know that is done for a particular reason. And most of the time, we do not designate that action as moral because we seem to assume that we know the reason. Now, the act itself can never be considered to be moral because that act, whatever it is not something that everybody is capable of doing. So if you say donating $1 million is moral, you are implicitly saying that those who are not donating $1 million cannot be moral. So you are making being moral an exclusive act, right? So you are advantageous. And some people argue that by saying like, oh, I cannot afford morality. I cannot be moral because I have other things to be concerned about. I have other concerns. It might be my economic well-being. It might be, well, family, etc. And Kant says, you don't have to be moral. Nobody has, I mean, of course, you have an obligation for yourself to be moral if you do, but he's not telling everybody, oh, you should be moral, you should do this, you should not do that. That is actually kind of immoral to kind of like telling other people how they should act. All Kant is saying, when you act and when you do something, don't pretend that it is moral in addition to being advantageous for you. And if it is advantageous for you, that's good. Good. You are a selfish person. You can do whatever you want. I mean, I may or may not judge you according to how much I like you, etc. But I will never designate your action as moral. Because the morality of the action is not in the action itself, because that is empirical, that is contextual, that changes according to space and time. But the reason, the principle can always be the same. Principle can always be an unchanging moral law, but the action itself cannot be. But when we commit an act, we do it for two different general reasons. And he says on page 13, the end of that first paragraph, for the will, the human will, that's what we have. the will. Namely, initially I suggested that in terms of imagination, namely something I want it to happen, I think it should happen, or it should happen differently. That is the idea of human will bringing about certain consequences in the world through our actions. So the will stands, as it were, at a crossroads between a priori principle, a principle that is independent of all experience. That's what a priori means according to Kant. It's a rational principle. It is not something that is empirical, which is a very important distinction to recognize, because most of our principles are empirical, therefore they can never work as moral law, including what is perhaps the most potentially universalizable empirical principle of morality. In your mind, what would be that principle? Most potentially universalizable empirical principle. Any ideas?
Possibly the golden rule, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Yes, but that's not specifying any action. Like,
Right.
tell me something, do not do this. And that can possibly be a universal moral law. I thought this was kind of commonsensical, but maybe it's not. If there is a moral principle that might apply for all human beings, what would you say? In light of golden rule too, you can think about that. What is it that I want to be that I don't want to die, therefore I don't want to kill anybody, so thou shalt not kill is probably the most universal, possibly universal principle, right? Because I've never met a culture, however remote and interesting it is, that says thou shalt kill. Under all circumstances, thou shalt kill. I mean, that never really observed. So can, according to Kant, you should not kill become a principle? For Kant, no. It cannot be a universal principle because it depends on the circumstances. Because we kill people. We don't call it murder because we say, thou shalt not murder, but you can kill. And like state-sanctioned killing, there's a war, there's a death penalty, we kill. And self-defense, like it cannot possibly become a universal law for all human beings rationally. Because the fact is, why are you not killing? Like you can't go around and say, so am I going to be able to say like, I'm really moral today because I didn't kill anybody? Tomorrow, I don't know. But so far I am moral because I, so why didn't you kill? Well, because you are afraid of rotting in jail. You are afraid of, the consequences. And if you are not killing because you are afraid of consequences, I don't consider that action particularly moral. It's kind of self-interest. And a lot of people are good out of this self-interest. It might be not going to jail, but most importantly, out of the desire to appear to be moral. In our 21st century, I think that's the most important motivation. Like, I want to appear to be moral. First of all, I want to be liked. Secondly, I don't want to be hated. Thirdly, I want to sell my products. Fourthly, I don't want to be ostracized from the society. Like, there are multiple reasons why we act seemingly moral, where we know it is not really purely moral, it is just out of self-interest. And some people say, oh, I have like this, when I do moral acts, I am particularly happy. Well, that's not morality. You are a selfish person trying to make yourself happy, and therefore you are acting like that. Act like that when you have no happiness, you have all the terrible circumstances, still act like that, then maybe I'll believe you. So our will is at the crossroads. We can act out of a priori principles, which is formal, he says, and it's a posteriori incentive. You have an incentive to do something, which is material, always because of something in the world. Punishment, reward, social standing, self-love, etc. And since it must be determined by something, it must be determined by the formal principle of volition if the action is done from duty. And in that case, every material principle is taken away from it. So you can only tell that an action is moral if all these material principles are taken out of it. And religious principles, cultural principles, legal principles, they're all material principles. When people say, oh, I act morally because I am God-fearing, that, according to Kant, might be a religious act. It might even be commendable, but it's not moral because your motivation is the material principle of fear. You don't want to be punished. You want to go to heaven. That's a very self-interested, selfish reason to act in a certain way. What if somebody decides, I don't care whether I go to heaven or not? Then they can kill me. So that's really the motivation behind Kant, that it must be unconditional. It must not depend on any material principle. Now, most of you are already coming out of a discourse and tradition in which you are expecting morality to tell you what to do, what not. And that sort of material, you are seeking for a material principle and moral guidance. Tell me what to do, tell me not what to do, etc. Kant believes, as a rational being, you know whether your action is moral or not before you commit the act. If you don't know before committing the act and maybe think like, oh, depending on what happens, it may or may not be moral, that is not morality. You know what the right thing to do is. You may or may not do it because you are a human being. You might be able to follow the principle, but in each case, you know. And we sort of overemphasize the necessity of these ambiguous situations. Now, most of those ambiguous situations are actually not choices between morality and immorality. It is between morality and something else. It might be self-interest, it might be commitment to your friends, to your family, etc. But morally, it must be, according to Kant, you know why you are doing what you are doing. And if you know why you are doing what you are doing, you know beforehand whether it's moral or not. Regardless of the circumstances that you cannot control either. Yes, your action might, in very, very rare cases, lead to disastrous circumstances, disastrous consequences. But that's really not where the morality or the question of morality of your action lies. It lies in the a priori principle. Now, Kant gives you a formal. Formal, namely, it only concerns the structure, the form of your subjective principles. Now, subjective principle he names on page 13, footnote 13, as maxim. Maxim is a technical term that he says is a subjective principle of volition. That might sound a little bit confusing. It's simply, why are you doing what you are doing? What is the principle behind your action? According to what criterion are you acting? Now, he doesn't say have this reason or that reason, etc. all he says, as he formulates on page 14, is that I should never act, this is on page 14, the first full paragraph towards the middle, I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my subjective maxim should become a universal law. So this is the famous categorical imperative for Kant. It is categorical. We'll discuss what categorical is in the second section. But it commands unconditionally. And its role only commands act according to a principle which can become a universal law for all human beings. If it cannot become a universal law for all human beings, that principle is not moral. It might be self-affirming, it might be expedient, it might be good, etc. So the sort of structure of Kant's argument is that just will the law. It doesn't tell you which law, what law. He commands lawfulness. Act in such a way that your principle, not your action, because not everybody can do what you can do, but everybody can act out of the same principle, can become a universal law. Now, he gives an example with respect to lying, which is a really great example which explains the logic of his thinking, and therefore it illustrates its rationality better. So, for example, there is a situation in which you are going to tell a lie to somebody. Now, whatever that reason is, for example, in order not to get into trouble. Now, if you make that, in order not to get into trouble, lie. You can lie. If that were become a universal law, then everybody who, for different reasons, for different circumstances, get into a difficult situation would lie. Right? So if you apply categorical imperative to that, you will make a universal principle that lie is always a possibility. Right? Now, if that happens, a lot of people think, oh, then everybody would lie. No, that's not the problem. Not that everybody can lie, but nobody can lie. Because for lie to function as a lie and get you out of the difficult situation, it must be believed. So you still want the universal condition to be telling the truth so that my lie functions as a lie. Because the logic of the lie only is dependent on the person believing you. If the person doesn't believe you, it won't even function as a lie. So the logical consequence of making lying a universal principle is not that everybody lies, but nobody can lie. It undermines itself. It makes itself impossible. You cannot lie if you want lie to be a universal principle. That's the logic of his thinking. That's the logic of morality. You always want a universal for something to function the way you want it. And that's a similar dilemma that we are encountering with people sort of struggling with imposing certain criteria to other people. You already are doing that implicitly by excluding those people from those principles. So when you say something like, you should respect all cultures, should you also respect all cultures who don't respect other cultures? And that's really the logical and rational dilemma that we are facing. We are proposing a universal condition, and whether we admit it or not, we want that universal condition, like every culture should be respected, so that some cultures may choose not to respect other cultures. So that universal principles you cannot exclude from anybody. So you cannot say, oh, you are poor, you can lie, or you are, a victim, you can lie. No, that actually is really undermining the dignity of the person that you are supposedly protecting. And that's Kant's point. So, yes, a lot of people in different circumstances will have various reasons to lie. I might not judge them culturally. I might not, be prejudiced against them, etc. But I'm never going to say what they are doing is moral, because that would be disrespecting them. Because I'm saying that they are not capable of morality. Now, for various reasons, and I'm not telling anybody to be moral all the time, or it's not even possible, and most of our actions are not even moral or immoral. They are just action. I'm hungry, I eat. There is really nothing moral or immoral about that, because it is about my incentives, about my inclinations. I determine my will according to a posteriori incentives. I'm hungry, I eat, period. But if I commit an act because of a reason that is a priori generalizable, not just generalizable, but universalizable, then that might be a moral act, because it is valid for all human beings. I don't exclude anybody. So Kant is it's beautiful because it is neither judgmental nor self-righteous. They're probably the same thing a little bit. But so you don't exclude anybody from the possibility of morality. So you give each person, regardless of the circumstances, the dignity of acting possibly moral. And you don't judge them if they don't, because their circumstances are different. But just because of those circumstances, I'm not going to exclude them from the possibility of being moral. This is when we supposedly acting out of the goodwill towards other people and say, oh, you are sort of not capable of morality. I understand. You have been having hard time. You should not act moral. And we think this is good. We think that this is us being compassionate and nice, etc. We are actually undermining the dignity of the person, because we are telling them, oh, I understand, you are not as good as I am, you are not capable of morality. So if you are Christian, for example, and if you think that your morality comes from Christian, and it's also like being tolerant to other cultures is a peculiarly Christian concept, because it comes out of this paternalistic sort of tendency. Oh, the other people who don't have Christianity, they cannot be moral, so we should tolerate them. So the 21st century Western cultural relativism and sensitivity is actually the other side of this Christian imperialism. Namely, oh, you are not capable of doing that. So we tolerate the moral ambiguity of the third world countries because, oh, poor, they are oppressed. As if that is some kind of cultural sensitivity, but not morally not accepting their dignity. So it is the same. For all our discussions, we really need to be honest. Namely, like, yes, I might culturally be sensitive to other societies, and I should be. Yes, but that doesn't happen out of a sort of paternalistic, patronizing attitude of, oh, you are not capable of it. So I like that aspect. So go ahead.
I just didn't really get, like, so you mean like if you forgive someone like being immoral and like perceive them as like they cannot be moral and forgive them being like immoral, you mean like you exclude them from like idea of morality, right? Is that correct?
Yes, and that's patronizing. That's somehow thinking that you are superior to them, that you can be moral and they cannot be moral, and you do it in the name of not judging them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't judge you because you have different criteria than I do. You are not capable of morality. Yeah.
Okay. And then like how, like, so like universalizing the idea, like the principle can lead to like their exclusion, or?
Well, Kant believes that everybody is potentially capable of acting out of a universalizable law. They may or may not act, and I cannot even know why a person is doing what they are doing.
Yeah.
But everybody is capable of that. Now, not everybody, obviously I should be sensitive, will come up with the same material principle of morality. Yes, they might be coming up with different material principles, and they are irrelevant. I mean, irrelevant for morality, of course, that's very relevant for cultural discussions. But when you say they are capable of morality as much as anybody,
yeah,
they are not excluded from the domain and the possibility of morality because they are rational and they are capable of acting out of a principle just like everybody else. So it is universalizable.
Okay.
So we need to be very careful not being patronizing in our attitude towards the others to be understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, I suspect I shouldn't say that in public, but sometimes anthropologists seem to do that. It sort of, that's the origin of my fight with anthropologists sometimes. They sort of think, oh, I study other cultures, ethnography, that makes me culturally sensitive, blah, blah, which is great, wonderful, but you should not be patronizing towards them to kind of exclude them from possibility of some universal standards.
Okay.
Not your standards, mind you. I'm sensitive to that. Not your own standards, but they are as much capable of reason. And maybe we should really listen to them in order to construct that universal discourse rather than like an exception, different, and therefore not at the same level. So we really tolerate the other. We don't even look at the other as the potential to contribute to our universal understanding. So we have all these like interesting cultures doing interesting different things, etc. But we still think ours is the norm.
Okay.
I'm wondering how you think this ties into like the way we treat younger kids.
Yeah.
Like not holding them to the same standard that we would hold each other to. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, that's actually kind of universal too, to a certain extent, I would say. I mean, of course, you need to. Well, because we assume that their rationality is not fully developed. They are not fully capable of using their reason. So this is a sort of rational human being, etc. But I don't know when that happens empirically. I mean, if you are precocious and then you do that at the age of 12, as opposed to there are 45-year-old colleagues of mine who are still not capable of rational thinking. So that's not like an empirical question, more like I mean, it is an empirical question. So that's a good question. But I mean, even we see some of the remnants of this in the law. Like we recognize, like you are not a fully adult, you are not capable of making your own decisions fully rationally, resist your temptations. And if you have some mental disorder in which you are not capable of making, we recognize that too. You cannot maybe control your impulses in the same way that other people do. We recognize that too. How we even make a distinction between murder and manslaughter on the basis of, if you are under emotional distress and particularly emotional upheaval, we don't accept, you are still responsible, but you are not as responsible because every human being is capable. But to tell to somebody is like, oh, you can continue to commit crime because you are already irrational. That's like the worst thing to do for their dignity as a rational being, as a moral being. I mean, you can patronize children. I guess that's what you do. That's the definition of having children. But then I realized, you can do it only up to a certain point. After that, they just sort of don't go for it. That's a good question, yeah. So this whole idea of lie is the important point, because it's almost a logical contradiction. So he's not like sappy, and he doesn't say you should not lie, lying is bad, you'll burn in hell, your parents won't love you, all that stuff. He just said, if think about lying as universalizing the condition, then the action itself undermines, the principle itself undermines itself, because you cannot lie. And that's the logic of it. So even when you lie, and especially when you lie, you're not perhaps concerned about being moral or not. You just want to get out of the situation. But you also want a morality to be intact so that people believe you when you say something, such that you can lie. So if you say to me like, oh, I didn't do my paper because I was like, I say, I don't believe you. Everybody lies. And you are in a difficult situation. So that really undermines human communication too, because nobody would believe anybody. And you can't lie unless people believe you. It won't even be a successful lie, which you might experience sometimes with your parents, for example. You tell them something, they say, okay, I'll pretend that I believe you, but they don't. So it must be really rare too. Like and also like, why do people sort of get a reputation? Like, if you tell the truth and you tell the truth and you tell the truth, then you are in the best position to lie, as opposed to something who is a liar. Liars are actually sort of contradictory, because you have a reputation of lying because you are incapable of lying. So that's the dilemma that's the paradox of the whole situation. So does that make sense, how universality of the law functions, and how it something that doesn't fit the universalizability criterion undermines itself? Now, again, not every action needs to be moral or immoral. He's not sort of telling you like, whenever you do something, you always have to apply this criterion all the time and be paranoid about everything you do, blah, blah. No. I mean, sometimes, most of the time, we act because we have incentives, we have desires, we fulfill those desires. And that's a human condition, and Kant has no sort of quarrels with that. Just don't, on top of it, pretend that it is moral, because when you are doing that, when you are saying that your selfish actions are actually moral, you are undermining the value of morality. Don't be hypocritical, don't be dishonest in, oh, I want to do whatever I want to do. On top of it, I want to be moral. So therefore, in society, you observe people who hurt morality the most are not killers and murderers, those who constantly talk about morality and try to make other people feel bad about morality. Those are the ones that are most harmful to the discourse of morality, because they pretend something that they don't even understand. That's actually worse, because killers and murderers kind of confirm our sense of morality. We still get stronger in our belief because these are horrible people, etc. It's the so-called good people who are pretending to be moral are much more likely to make us cynical about morality, because we know that they are doing it for selfish reasons. I mean, I'm not endorsing killers and murderers, of course. I mean, their function is simply to make us believe in morality more. That's all. So I don't want to be a misunderstanding. I mean, this is also politically true too. People who hurt our principles the most are the ones who pretend to be on our side and try to act out of moral principles. They undermine our belief in morality and the value of morality the most for us, because they betray in a way that those who are opposed to us simply confirm our convictions, but those who betray our convictions are the most problematic for us. And that will be the disappointing. You will say, oh, I believe that my wonderful role model turned out to be not moral. That really makes me more sad than somebody that I already didn't like anyway. And that is really the criterion, in the sense that don't pretend that you are moral when you are doing it out of selfish reasons. And that's also a selfish thing. Like, a lot of people just want to be moral, like as if that's kind of like a branding or something. I'm moral. Like, recognize me as moral. It's like, you can't. Nobody can. Only you can know why you are doing what you are doing. So you are in no position to judge or to be judged by anybody else. Now, that aspect of it is, of course, problematic, because at the end of the day, you are going to say, what good is this for us? Like, am I going to be able to judge other people if that's what your inclination is? Or how am I supposed to act? Nobody can decide that for you. That's why initially I was sort of making this point about the problematic nature of role models. They grow up and they act in a completely different context. By imitating them, you cannot get anywhere, because you cannot reproduce the same circumstances ever. You need to speak about the principles, not about people. I mean, in terms of morality, of course, if you want to be I don't know, like a singer, you should imitate some people maybe, but that's fine to have role models. Like, I mean, you should take that role model to be the role model of whatever they are doing. Like, so, if you want to play the violin, you should imitate somebody only in playing violin, not in their moral conviction.
So like you mean like only you yourself know that, like know your like motivation, like a reason of your doing, and only you can judge whether you are moral or not, and that does not apply to others, right? Is that correct?
Well, yes, but with qualification. I mean,
Yeah.
if somebody is acting completely selfish,
Mm-hmm.
then I can perhaps say that they are doing it for these motivations. I might not actually know, but I have a very strong suspicion that they are actually doing this. I mean, Bill Gates, like, I can never believe that he is moral. I'm sorry, because he's always doing it out of some self-interest. But that, in principle, actually is not the case, because only they can know why they are doing what they are doing. And of course, the difficulty with Kant and subsequent philosophy after Kant will be, do you know why you are doing what you are doing? Are you honest with yourself, or can you truly understand yourself? This is the sort of modernity, this is the notion of subjectivity, where I think, therefore I am, I know myself better than anything else, I have this self-transparent relationship with myself. But that's not necessarily the case either. So I don't know most of the time why I'm doing what I'm doing. And most of the time when I accuse other people of immorality, I'm actually accusing myself. And that's the dilemma here, that Kant presumes that you can potentially know your motivations.
Mm-hmm. But that does not mean that you are actually like knowing your like motivation.
Well, I don't know. I mean, at least we cannot assume that it
Okay.
is. So that's a question, because sometimes you don't know why you are doing what you're doing. You can't even distinguish for yourself. Is this because of fear? Is this because of consequences? Is this because of self-love? Is it because of, I don't know.
Okay.
So again, I mean, I'm not reading Kant in order to teach us how to be moral. I'm not reading Kant in sort of propose him as the ultimate and the final word on the issue, etc. But some of the concepts and insights and rational principles that he introduces helps us to understand a lot of actions and behavior around us. And I like that aspect of it. So it gives us a map or a structure according to which we can look around and sort of understand our context, our culture. That aspect is very important philosophically. And it's not a question of like, oh, you need to be a Kantian and you need to believe everything what he says and you should always act according to what Kant says, blah, blah. No, it is a discourse that gives you a map to understand what is happening around you. For me, I mean, that's what I like. That's all. Like, that's why, like, I never read him as sort of the authority. I never read him as like, oh, this is someone we should follow or something like that. You should never read anybody like that, but you know, especially not Kant, because he also happened to be a horrible person too. I mean, not horrible, but like he was, you know, he's like, he lived in 1724 and 1804, and he lived in Europe. So that's like the definition, like the prime example of white European male, and all the things that he believes, all the worldview, all the other cultures that he judges is the result of that. So it would not be a very pleasant experience to be around him. I need to say that too. So that. And he also speaks German, so that's an additional difficulty to hang around. Okay, so we are going to start with the second section, in which he moves from the what he calls popular moral philosophy. So far, he says, I'm only appealing to your insights from your everyday understanding of the concept of duty and the law. You know intuitively whether an action is moral or not, depending on these circumstances. And I guess the issue here is when you hear his reasoning, you say, uh-huh, I understand it, because that's how I already think. And you say, yes, if you are acting out of a selfish reason for self-promotion, you cannot say you are moral. That is moral reasoning. That is the same for everybody. Here, at least in this room, but also for all rational beings. Now he's saying that let's move to the metaphysics of morals. What kind of philosophical assumptions are we making underlying these everyday beliefs? So we realize that our reasoning somehow makes us pretty clear, and this is what he considers the pure a priori principles. That is almost like logic, except this is applied to morality and the pure aspect of morality. We as human beings are all capable of moral reasoning. Capable. We all have the same power. We might not experience it, exercise it in the same way, but we all have this capability. And reason in German, Vernunft, the word is already speaking to a potentiality, a power. And it's not an actual thing. Therefore, you should never be confused like, oh, I know some irrational people, blah, blah. That's not the issue. Even designating somebody as irrational is really assuming that that person should have rationality. That power resides in everybody, and everybody is capable of that moral reasoning. Capable, not actual. So, in fact, he says, there is absolutely no possibility by means of experience to make out with complete certainty a single case in which the maxim of an action that may in other respects conform to duty has rested solely on moral grounds and on the representation of one's duty. So he says that explicitly, in any case, you may never be able to know why somebody is doing something. In fact, most of the time you don't. But because you can never know the empirical circumstances. But if there is an empirical circumstance, if there's an expectation of an advantage, a consequence, a result, then you know that is not motivated with morality. It is motivated with that particular reason. So when I hear that Bill Gates donated $1 million to a charity, then I'm saying, oh, okay. Then I found out that there's a circumstance in which, by virtue of that, he avoided 10 million of taxes. Then I say, oh, that's a circumstance. That's a condition that I didn't know about. Now, I still don't know why he did what he did, but I have a strong suspicion that he did it because of avoiding $10 million of taxes. In fact, the idea for Kant is that if Bill Gates or anybody else acted morally, I wouldn't even know it. And that's really kind of the beauty of Kant, what he gives us personally, in the sense that you don't really need to show anybody you are moral. You don't have to prove anybody that you are a pure, wonderful, moral being. Only you know it, and that's it. That is an incredible sort of notion of you are not responsible for anybody other than yourself. Hence, you are responsible for all humankind. So, and you also know, as a general principle maybe in life, is that those people who are not making a big show out of their moral sensibility are the most moral ones. And you know, when people are desperately trying to prove that they are moral, they are probably trying to cover up something. Now, again, this is not a universal principle. This may or may not be true. But in general, that's how I operate. Why are you so anxious to show that you are moral? Why are you judging everybody else in their sort of shortcomings of morality if you don't have the dignity to be moral in and of yourself without the approval of anybody else? I mean, mostly we want that. I mean, I guess mostly we do it for approval. Like, please recognize me as moral. Please see and sort of approve that I'm moral. So everywhere, he says, we look on page 20, we everywhere come up with the dear self, which is always turning up and upon which the intent of our action is based rather upon the strict command of duty. So nobody is doing just out of duty, that they are doing because of self-interest. So if you are going to come up with a law that is valid for all rational beings, he says it is clear that no experience can give occasion for inferring even the possibility of such apodeictic meaning certain, definite laws. So no religion, no specific principle can provide that apodeictic law. So again, this is his insight, like, if you are saying that my morality is based on something, you are actually, according to Kant, saying that it's not morality. So for example, if I say, I repeat that, I gave that example, but in this context, I'll just repeat it. I base my morality on Islam, for example. That means I have an exclusive access to morality against all those people who are not Muslim. Those people don't have the possibility of being moral I say that implicitly. But I'm also saying on top of it, they don't have the obligation to be moral. So if somebody says like, I base my morality on Christianity, I can say, oh, tough, bad for you, because I don't need to be moral because I'm not Christian. So I can kill you, technically, without it being immoral, because the same rules don't apply to us. Then they will say, I mean, unless they kill me, they'll say, well, you should not kill. I said, why? Because Christianity says that. Well, I'm not Christian, so I can kill. I mean, it's an absurd consequence, of course, because you don't want people to be moral just because they are out of a religion. So you can't exclude them, but you cannot sort of allow them to act towards you accordingly, because you have a minimal expectation of rationality from them and not kill you. So the logic of it is that it must be valid for all human beings, regardless of race, religion, context, culture, everything. And if we believe that our principles are right, we believe them on the basis that it is applicable potentially to all human beings. Now, if this is a material principle, it can easily lead to, as Riley was saying, like imperialist gestures. Namely, oh, you need to accept this principle because this, but that's a material principle. Kant would never endorse that and can never endorse that. You only have that kind of universalizability as a rational principle that everybody is capable of, not anything specific that is actual. Now you can say you should never universalize because you are afraid of being an imperialist. You say you should never universalize. You should never have anything. Well, sure, you should not never impose them by force upon other people. But that doesn't get you out of the problem of excluding those people out of the principle of morality. You can say, I'm immoral, I can never be moral, therefore nobody can be moral. Fine, but nobody is saying that. Everybody is saying that everybody has different sets of morality, which is a lazy way of getting rid of imperialist tendencies by simply reversing them. You are not really doing anything. You are not getting anywhere. You are just sort of denying a logical principle in order not to appear again to be imperialist, whereas you are being actually imperialist. Okay, I guess I'll stop here. I want you to read the second section again, up to page, like finish it. So up to page 48. And we'll start on Tuesday with the protocol, but also with this very important section on page 23. I want you to read the last paragraph of 23 very carefully, the sentence starting, everything in nature works according to laws. That there, I think, is yet another articulation of the logic of Kant's thinking. So once we read that section, we'll talk about that. We'll juxtapose that to the part on page 13, that the a posteriori incentive and a priori principles. And we are going to try to understand, in light of all these, Kant's idea of freedom, what freedom means, which will turn out to be something completely different than what we imagine freedom means. So that's going to be our discussion on Tuesday. But we'll have that in the first half of the class a little bit, but then I want to see all of you who are on campus on Tuesday.